It's the dramatic deterioration in public health that's caused the Yemen war to return to the headlines. With up to 14 million people in danger from famine, it's displaced Syria as the humanitarian agency's prime global concern. Add to that Saudi Arabia is on the back foot over the Khashoggi affair.
It's very timely that this issue of the war is looked at again now. And what's interesting now is you've got senior, very well-placed American officials saying this has got to stop. It would seem from what we have heard, or indeed in some cases not heard from the British government, that we on our side have got a bit of catching up to do, quite frankly. And I think one interesting thing about the arms sales and the extremely deep relationships which both the Americans and the British have with the Saudis compared to any other country, we are actually in a position to be moral leaders in this.
The UK remains secondary to the US as an arms supplier to the Saudi-led coalition, but it does have multi-billion-pound contracts ongoing to supply fighters and the weapons that go on them. And that sense that Britain isn't doing all it could to pressure its Saudi ally to end the conflict isn't helped by a tougher line coming from France also.
We've applied relentless pressure in support of the UN in order to find a political solution, because the military situation is a stalemate. This war must stop now. That's the priority.
The 4-year-old conflict has pitted the officially recognised government, strongest in the south around Aden, against the Houthis, Shia militants who are strongest in the west of the country. In recent months, the Saudi-led coalition backing the government has closed in on the port of Hodeidah on land and blockaded it from the sea. In doing so, they've put pressure on the rebels, but at great cost in terms of aggravating the humanitarian crisis. It's the threat of starvation and the calling of peace talks in Sweden in November that have caused the Americans to announce a package of confidence-building measures they'd now like to see.
30 days from now, we want to see everybody around a peace table based on a ceasefire, based on a pullback from the border, and then based on ceasing dropping of bombs that will permit the special envoy, Martin Griffiths, who's very good, he knows what he's doing, to get them together in Sweden and end this war.
Central to what happens next is a British diplomat, Martin Griffiths, who now serves as the UN's peace negotiator. It was actually the Houthi rebels who stymied the last round of talks in Geneva, but they're saying they'll come this time.
We've had a contact with them only this morning in Sana'a, and they're watching this with great care, of course. I think that we're all worried about Hodeidah, but I'm pretty sure that, firstly, that they will come to the consultations this time, and secondly, that they will be open to the kind of measures of de-escalation, as they call it.
De-escalation from the Houthi side means moving back missiles they've been firing at Saudi cities. A former military attaché to Saudi Arabia now argues that it's time to pressure the kingdom also.
Martin Griffiths, as the UN envoy, who's been there a few months, who again I know personally, is working very hard to try to get the talks up and running. My concern would be that if it's just more of the same, it's actually not going to change anything. And therefore, in my opinion, the way to do this would actually be to use the levers, or potentially use the levers which we have, which goes back to the arms sales. Again, how that's put across to the Saudis, that's the job of the diplomats in order to do it in such a way that the Saudis don't take gross offence.
Nobody thinks the Yemen talks will be easy, but for the first time since the war started, there seems to be some real international will to bring the players to have a serious negotiation.
Mark Urban, well, our political editor, had some time with the Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt today, and Nick joins me now. What was his attitude to this idea of a 30-day ceasefire?
Well, he said the announcement from Washington overnight were extremely welcome. He said there's a possibility that if this initiative could succeed, it could avert that humanitarian catastrophe and has the potential to build what he called a durable peace. But it's also interesting that the Foreign Secretary also told me that he believes that it is possible that the murder of Jamal Khashoggi has given the US and the UK space to put pressure on Saudi Arabia. Of course, the de facto ruler of the kingdom, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, he's obviously overseeing the Saudi-led coalition in that war against Yemen, and it's also his allies that are allegedly linked to the murder in Istanbul. So, Foreign Secretary saying UK and US willing to deliver a tough message. Obviously, critics will say, we've heard that sort of thing before. This is what the Foreign Secretary told me.
What I would say is that it is because we have that strategic relationship with Saudi Arabia, because America has that relationship, that we are in a position to ask them to do things that we couldn't do if we didn't have that relationship. And so now what we need to do is to use that relationship to push for progress. I think it's too early to say there are green shoots. There are still terrible things happening every day. The humanitarian situation is truly appalling. But there is an opportunity now, and we must grasp it.
Jeremy Hunt. Well, joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Ambassador Thomas Shannon. Until June, he was the third most senior figure in the U.S. State Department and led U.S. delegations on Yemen peace talks. And in the studio with me is Safa Al Ahmad, a journalist who's worked in Yemen and visited remote Houthi areas and is finishing a documentary she shot there. Good evening to both of you. Thank you very much for coming in. First of all, Ambassador, in your view, is there a linkage between the Khashoggi murder and a kind of altered set of arguments over Yemen?
There's a linkage, but it's not direct. The reality is the fighting in Yemen has been extremely unpopular in the U.S. Congress, and the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, which has horrified our Congress, has just created a bigger problem for the Saudis that has to be dealt with. And this affects directly arms sales and any number of initiatives with the Saudis that pass through our Congress. And so the administration is very intent on trying to clear some of this out and address the most immediate problem that they can address easily, and that is the question of Yemen. And so the effort by Secretary Mattis and by Secretary Pompeo is very important. It will certainly have support in our Congress, and I think it's going to bring everybody to the table.
Safa, right now you're editing a documentary you've just shot in Yemen. What's your view of the American position?
Well, I think what's going on in Yemen are three layers of war. You have the local domestic war between the Houthis and the so-called legitimate government of Yemen, but you also have the level of the Saudi coalition. And the oldest of these three levels is the American involvement in what they call counterterrorism war against AQAP in Yemen. And so the Americans have been involved on the ground in killing civilians for much longer than the Saudi coalition even.
So in that case, if that's your analysis, Ambassador Shannon, you hear the analysis of Safa there, that the Americans, you know, have got blood on their hands in the Yemen conflict as well. How important is it for the Americans to step back and let Martin Griffiths be the one to lead this? Because, you know, as part of the coalition, they're not trusted by the Houthis, obviously.
I think, as made clear by Secretary Mattis, the whole purpose here is to call for a ceasefire, to create a space in which the parties can sit down and talk, and, as your Foreign Secretary noted, create some kind of humanitarian assistance process. In this regard, I think that in doing so, the purpose is to create space for Martin Griffiths to do his job. And he's a superb diplomat. And I think what he's going to be able to do is bring the parties together and start a process that we hope is going to lead to more than just a ceasefire, but some kind of political deal. It is important to note that the larger counterterrorism campaign is separate from the other fighting that's been taking place, especially the fighting between the Houthi government, the Houthis, that has drawn in both the UAE and Saudi Arabia.
It's definitely a factor, and it says, Safa, just before I come back to you, Safa, just a year ago you were here with Boris Johnson when he was Foreign Secretary. There was a summit. Do you wish that actually perhaps there'd been greater resolve a year ago and we wouldn't be a year down the line with the possibility of a ceasefire?
Always. The Foreign Secretary, the then Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson, I think, made a huge effort especially with the Saudis and the UAE, to try to focus more on the humanitarian side of this and to see what would come next. But unfortunately, at that point, the Houthis were not prepared to engage, I think, in a meaningful way in stepping away from their missile attacks into Saudi Arabia. And in this regard, the Saudis and the UAE in particular felt they had no other choice but to continue along their path.
Okay, Safa, let me just ask you about Prince Mohammed bin Salman, because, of course, at the moment the focus is on him over the Khashoggi murder, whether or not we know his people were involved. Do you think that he, in regard to even this Yemeni possibility of a ceasefire, will be sidelined a bit, or is he still the person who's really driving that coalition?
I don't think that Mohammed bin Salman is going to be sidelined by this. I think he's still holding a lot of popularity domestically inside Saudi Arabia. And there's very little criticism of the Yemen war inside Saudi Arabia. And so I don't see that being, and I agree with the Ambassador, there is not going to be that direct impact on the Crown Prince. The question is, will he be forced to have major concessions? Because there is no way that the Saudis can get out of this with a clear win, with kicking out the Houthis out of Sana'a. That, I think, is not possible. But what the Saudis have to deal with, and the Saudi coalition, including the Emiratis, have to lift the blockade on Yemen. Because what's happening in Yemen, the Yemenis are not starving, they're being starved. Yes. And that's an important distinction, that the Saudi coalition and the Houthis bear responsibility on either end of this.
Yes, this idea that food cannot get in, food and supplies cannot get in, and on top of that, the Yemeni economy is shot to pieces, that there has to be some massive rebuilding program if this is to succeed, Ambassador.
Yes, without a doubt. This conflict is horrific, and the only response to it is to weep. As you have noted, the impact, the humanitarian impact is frightening. And it is incumbent upon all of us, not only strategically and politically, but also morally, to address this.
And what do you think is the nature of the message coming from the White House? Do you think that's coordinated? Do you think President Trump is entirely on board with this?
I do. I mean, Secretary Mattis and Secretary Pompeo are speaking for the President. They're speaking for the United States. And the immediacy of the support and response from the UK and others indicates that this was coordinated with our partners. So this is a very, very serious effort, and it needs to be understood that way.
Safa, is this the best chance of success so far?
Well, I think all Yemenis hope so.
Thank you very much.